I was thinking maybe they were going to change their name on your sweatshirt to Frank and Moose.
Yeah, Franken Moose. That makes sense right there. Yeah, nice little place. You been there, Doctor?
I have been there. And I figured out something.
Yeah.
If you go there to eat in their restaurant and you eat in the and you don't get the all-you-can-eat chicken, but you buy the chicken portion that gives you like 4 pieces of chicken, and then they give you a bowl of all the sides. Then you can take all of that food with you if you don't eat it all when you leave, and that actually gives you more food than if you can only, and it's cheaper than the meal where you can eat everything, because more likely you will get more food than you can eat in one sitting with that meal.
Exactly.
And that's actually a better deal.
Yeah, Marlene and I went to that place, the Zenders. It's pretty good.
Dr. E, Charlotte is sick today, so she'll be on Zoom. I don't know if she's
Right,
in
so-
the waiting room or.
I thought I changed that. Okay, here she is. Do we want to admit her?
Let's vote on it. No.
Yes, we do. There she goes. Here she's in. Okay. I thought I had updated that to take away that requirement. So that didn't happen, even though I thought I had. Sorry about that, Charlotte. You were stuck in the waiting room, and then someone reminded me that I should check that, and there you were, waiting. But, all right. That was probably my problem on the 6th, that you were in the waiting room, weren't you? And then we finally got you in. So anyway. Good. All right, so let's have prayer and then we'll begin. Today we're going to be looking at and maybe finishing up dealing with this lesson, and then we will be looking at the 2 conferences in the 20th century, how they impact things. And hopefully before I leave, on Friday, we'll begin the next thing, but hopefully before I leave, I hope to send you my study guide for the final exam. If not, it'll be right after I get back, because next week, May 4th, I will not be with you. But I am going to be in Indiana, so that's a day off. And then on the 6th, when I get back, you'll have your papers ready. So if you need to talk to me about it, see me before I leave on Sunday afternoon. So this week, Thursday, Friday, so forth, that's when I'll be available for consultation. So let's have prayer. Father, we do thank you in coming to us, strengthening us in our understanding of missions, and we pray that you will come and help us to finish up this material and to know you and to understand you with how you work in expanding your presence around the world. And so we look for your hand in this teaching process. We hope that each student, as they are working on and completing their papers, that you are giving them wisdom to accomplish that and express your value in all that you do. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Okay, all right, what is imperialism? So the question could be, there has been little consensus over the exact meaning of the term that originated in the 1840s. The essence may be defined as the domination of one country of a political, economic, or cultural life of another. And so in its most basic form, you could say that colonialization of an area by a power, whether a Western power or some other power, that would be imperialism. But you could say that, corporate interests that control resources or the like would also have an imperialistic mindset. Political and involved political and involves the conquest of territory and the formation of colonies. So that is a definite presentation. If you were going to go to the university and study a course on this, some scholars would argue that there are 12 distinct stages of colonization. So that's a 12-step program. And then after you're done, you'll probably need counseling. So, so it's 12 different stages of how this works. It's a dominated country in which its autonomous territory is protected by a stronger state in exchange for economic evangelization or economic entry. So a lot of countries would say some colonial attempts were never actually owned by another country, but you would say, we, the British or the French, whatever, will protect you. We'll see to it that you aren't conquered by somebody else, some other native tribe or some other country or whatever, and allow you to run things in exchange for you giving us trading rights and economic rights in your country. And so that also was a way that imperialism presented itself, or a sphere of influence when the dominant country has no military or political control, but exerts extreme economic influence. And this was true in places like, let's say, the Middle East. The British had spheres of influence in some of these coastal countries, like, let's say, Bahrain, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and places like that. They never actually controlled those places, but they were spheres of influence. And they did that in order to acquire oil eventually as a dominant consideration. And you would also see this in China, where most of the major cities on the coast were under some European influence, and they were divided up between the various countries. Now, characteristics of the high imperialist era. That's after 1880. Before that, imperialism was rather spotty. I mean, there were, especially in Africa. European nations switched from commercial ventures to active conquest of unclaimed territory. So before 1880, especially in Africa, but to a lesser degree, this would be Europe too, Asia as well. Countries were looking for trading rights and not really having actual conquest, but a change in the definition of a colony came when the Congo state was invented by King Leopold. When he acquired that, is that a colony could not just be, some historical presence or some trading rights, or, my explorers, like Portugal would say, my explorers landed in Mozambique in the 1400s, and therefore we claim this area. You had to have a presence there, occupy it, citizens of your country living there. And so lots of people claimed the Congo or wanted to have influence there, but Leopold said, I want to own it because no one really has occupied it, and I will send Belgians down there to do that. The idea of international competition complicated this because the whole system of these economies were based on having sort of a monopoly on the resources or the commercial interests of a particular area. Now, the rising nationalism in Europe, especially of France and Germany and Italy, desired a place for them to shine in the sun too. And so they wanted a piece of the colonial empire. They wanted to do this for their own economic advantage so that they could acquire resources, and also just to say, hey, look at me, we're a great country, we have colonies too. That is what this is, to enhance their national prestige in Europe. If you were a country and you didn't have colonies, then you were not really that great of a country. You could never claim that. And so some countries like Austria-Hungary or Russia were seen as lesser powers, partly because they didn't really have a colonial empire. Now, characteristics of the high imperialistic era. The colonial relationships were more pervasive. In this period from 1880 until 1914, 1915, right before the beginning of the Great War, colonialism became more pervasive. That is, it was everywhere, except for some very specific exceptions, like Thailand, which back then was called Siam. So you have Thailand, you have Ethiopia, and they were able to defeat the Italians. So they actually defeated the colonizing power, at least at that point in the 1800s, early 1900s, and remained independent. And then Liberia, which was also independent, and they were independent partly because of American influence. So it's not a American colony, but an American protectorate, sphere of influence, whatever the case you want to call it. So that's it. Everything else came under some colonial control, and that's the entire world was under colonial control, or had in North America, South America, became independent after being a colony. Then it was more intrusive. The formation of colonies had a greater impact on the local population. Before this, being a colony often did not really impact the life of the average colonist. They might not have even known they were colonists. After 1880, this is not the case. If there was some sort of economic adventure, they would be required to fulfill it. You knew you were now part of the British Empire, part of the French Empire, Portuguese, whatever the case may be. So there was, it was very intrusive into your life. And so it's much more troubling, the experience of being a colony, and exploitive, impact on the local population. Intrusive and exploitation might go together, but it wouldn't have to. If you were a colonist and you didn't know you were a colonist, that's one thing. But a country could make it known you're now part of the British Empire and still not exploit the people. And treat them bad. But more and more, there was exploitation during this period for the economic welfare of the mother country. Probably the British were the least exploitive, the French next, and then, unfortunately, the Spanish and the Portuguese, especially in Africa, the Portuguese are probably at the bottom of the list, and then King Leopold as an individual was just awful. In the video that we showed, maybe in a little more dramatic way than necessary, but does show that those people were really treated terribly. Bad enough that all the rest of the European powers told him to knock it off because you're making us all look bad. Now, imperial complications. From 1850 to 1960s, there was no consistency of colonial interests. And that should be wrong, 1860. Western countries exhibited only sporadic enthusiasm for imperial conquest. I'm gonna go ahead and change that right away so that I don't forget to do it later, otherwise I never will. There was no consistency of colonial interests. Western countries exhibited only sporadic enthusiasm for their imperial conquests. Imperialism is not only a Western phenomenon. In some cases, the Soviet Union could be seen as an imperial power that took over people groups that were the various Soviet states that are now independent countries, like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and all the rest of the stands. And then you had Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine. So all of those different places would be seen as Russian imperialism. And there's lots of places that are inside what we think of today as Russia proper, that are also, could almost be considered to be a colonial or imperial taking over of other places. The Mongols in India were also known for creating empires among themselves. The subcontinent of India, there were lots of different countries, and eventually they conquered each other, then they were taken over by the British. The Chinese and Japanese empires in the 20th century. So that also is interesting. The Chinese certainly grew. They might even to this day claim places like Vietnam, certainly Taiwan, northern China, Korea, Mongolia as part of the Chinese Empire. In recent years, the Chinese have taken over Tibet. Well, not real recently, like in the 1960s. But they took over Tibet, and that's still an issue with lots of people. The Muslim Uyghurs and other people groups of that type are from that area, and Tibet would like to get its independence. Not all forms of imperialism were the same. In Angola, the Portuguese supported the slave trade right into the 1970s. So they were supporting slavery, taking Africans back to Portugal and other places, to Brazil as slaves, maybe not into the 1970s, but they were doing slavery in Angola, forcing them to work right up to the end. They never really prepared their countries for independence at all. Japan was guilty of egregious abuse and war crimes. That's in the 20th century, especially in China, when they had conquered Manchuria, the northern part of China during the 1930s and 40s, and then during World War II, the Japanese did some horrible things. And then the British controlled areas were less exploitive due to a strong missionary lobby in the British Parliament and Britain's commitment to humanitarian objectives, but they were still not perfect, and there were some incidences where they were truly cruel, especially in India, right around the time of independence. They did some things to try and control that, and were seen as particularly cruel. And they also had some rules that were designed to help them maintain their economic power, like you couldn't make salt. That's one of the main things Gandhi does. He goes and makes salt because you had to buy salt from British suppliers, even though you could go down to the water and collect water and boil it and make your own salt. But that was illegal because you had to buy salt from British suppliers. That was the law. Imperialism and missions. A popular accusation is that Christian missions collaborated with European powers as agents of imperialism. And I'm sure that did happen. But you can make the case, or you can sort of make the claim that any interaction or overlap between missions and imperialism is an attempt by the missionaries to be exploitive or controlling, and that simply is not the case. But we have to be willing to admit there is overlap here. And it would be very hard if you were a British missionary or a French missionary or whatever the case may be, and you were working within a country, Africa, where your country was the colonizing power, to not enter into that arrangement with a feeling of independence and superiority to the local population. I think that would be very hard to avoid at some level, because you aren't Kenyan. And there are probably rights, privileges, opportunities that you have that they don't. And so that would be hard to avoid. So if there were locals who were upset about that, and of the native population, I think that could be easily, could easily become a problem. Now, sometimes this is made by Africans and Asians to the point that in many circles, it's an unquestioned truism, this particular, that missions and oppression go together. But that isn't the case. What you want to ask yourselves is, how did imperialism arise in a particular context? In some cases, the missionaries came first and the colonizers came second. And the fact that there were British or Portuguese or whatever missionaries in a particular area, then that opened the door to colonization. In other cases, it works the opposite way. In some cases, why did it arise as it did? There are certainly economic and other kinds of political considerations that would lead to why did imperialism arise in a particular area as it did. In some cases, it is a much more strident form of imperialism, where there is extreme exploitation and extreme intervention by the colonizing power and little investment. In some cases, especially if you see how the British handle things, often they did extract resources, but they provided infrastructure support that allows those countries to, now that they're independent, continue to have an industry of in the same way. So maybe they grew cotton, rubber, various other things. And now that they're independent, they're able to continue to make a profit off of those initiatives. And today in India and other countries, their economies are built around cheap manufacturing that they benefit from, that they have partly because of their legacy as a colonizing power. The relationship between the imperial power and their native subjects and how they related, how were they treated. I know there's a video that I've often shown about the Indian independence, and there's a lady there who is interviewed, and she says, now that we are independent, that India is its own country, we've made mistakes. And in the future, they'll probably make bigger mistakes. But we are a country, not a colony. As a way of looking at yourself, that we're independent. We're going to do things that are good or bad. And the question is how they were prepared for independence. And then how was decolonization taking place? In some cases, there was a systematic process when the colonizing power saw that they were ready for independence. This creates an issue, makes a way. Now, you look at India, that was the jewel of the empire. They were given a deal. You fight with us and support World War II. That's what America does in the Philippines too. You fight for us. You send soldiers, you fight in the war, you help us win the war, and at the end, we'll give you your independence as a reward. In some countries like Ghana in Africa, they basically they didn't really overthrow the British power, but it was an African takeover of the country. You look at Kenya, and that's a completely different situation, because in Kenya, unlike most other of the African colonies that Britain had, there were large numbers of British citizens that moved there to live, like coming to Pennsylvania during the colonial era. British citizens coming. When the United States got its independence, it wasn't an Indian uprising pushing out the colonists. That makes it a very different situation when you're talking about colonists overthrowing a colonial oppressor. That's a very different scenario than the Africans pushing out the British. So it was the colonists, the British colonists, who said, we no longer want to be British. It wasn't the native Indian population saying, we don't want the British here. That's a very different scenario entirely. In Kenya, there were a very large number of Europeans that had moved there, British, who were going to stay because the climate was good and they could live basically like they did in England, but cheaper. And they were there not as government officials, but as settlers. And that made the British look at Kenya completely differently. It's also true in South Africa, and to a lesser degree, the southern colonies like whatever they're called now, Upper North and South Rhodesia, Zimbabwe and Botswana, and those countries. They also have a lot of white population that is there, that are staying, that are settlers. And that creates a whole new dynamic of how you're going to transition. France tried to create something called assimilation, in which certain Africans, not all, were invited to become French, speak French, dress French, be French, eat French food. The problem was, no matter how much you did that, you didn't feel French, and then you didn't feel African anymore either. So France tried to include, especially Algeria in the North Africa, to make it part of France, France proper, like it was, France was also in Africa. And they wanted to extend that around the world to all of their colonies, that they were not colonies, but they were, France was just, they were all French citizens. But it didn't work out that way. Now, how did this impact negatively? And it will. Now, politically, arbitrary geographic boundaries drawn for the convenience of the colonizer creates problems to this very day. This is true in South America too, but it's not as big of an issue. I mean, the division between Portuguese, Brazil, and all the rest of the Spanish colonies has to do with decisions by the Pope more than anyone else, where the line is. And I don't know if the Indian population, the native population down in South America, how they would have divided up the countries into their own states would have done it, but it has nothing to do with the boundary lines of today. But Africa is even worse because there's so many countries. There was a period, there was an African association that had talked about, like redrawing the boundaries, but all that would do is create new chaos. Like you just wipe the slate clean and say, okay, Africans decide how your boundaries are supposed to be. The wars that would develop from that would also be a problem. So they decided to leave it as is, but it does create issues. Little regard was shown for the indigenous, ethnic, linguistic, cultural communities. So at times, ethnic groups are divided up into various countries so that if democracy, if you want to call it that, in some of these countries is basically tribal, all the members of one tribe vote together for their candidate, and there is oppression from other tribes. It would be better if you could just put all of one tribe in one country, and then they could be happier. But the Europeans wanted this kind of conflict because it made the countries easier to control. You could pit these different groups against each other, and then they would be fighting among themselves and not against you. But now, when you're trying to create a cohesive nation out of these countries, that conflict is counterproductive. And even stable democracies, theoretically stable democracies like in Kenya, they can descend into chaos too on occasion. But there have been genocide, Rwanda and other places, and that's caused partly because of some of these conflicts that were stirred up during colonial times. So unstable government, boundary clashes, civil wars, they are a legacy. Sudan, Somalia. Sudan is probably one of the few places where there's actually been independence in the South. Not that the people in the South, there's still trouble there, but they're independent. Sudan is another place. British or Somaliland. The British Somaliland in the north is an enclave of stability, but it can't get international recognition. The rest of Somaliland at times, or Somalia, is in chaos much of the time. So it is but they're not allowing them to become independent. Now, ideological. Western racial ideology assigned a negative value to all things African. So in looking at it, there was just a bias by the Europeans that their ways were better. And so the African way was not as good. And this then would translate into other types of eventually, a sense of inferiority or a loss of cultural pride could set in if you're constantly being told that the European way is better. The European way is just the European way. And in fact, in Africa, it might not be better. When you're looking at issues like how they did farming, when the European settlers came into South Africa, and then started traveling north, they eventually crossed an invisible line into the tropics. And that never had happened before, because whenever people migrated before, they went east and west and stayed pretty much on the same longitude or latitude line. So everywhere you were on the globe, the animals and plants you brought with you would grow just fine. But when they entered South Africa, they came north, and eventually they entered into an alien world that just was not working. And the Europeans were dying of disease, and their animals were dying, and they couldn't grow crops like they did. They tried to farm, and it just wasn't working. And looking all around them, there are Africans that are doing quite well. Because you just cannot live like Europeans there. And as a result, they should have tried to figure out how you live, what you are doing. But this can be a problem. So whether or not there was a sense of inferiority, the colonist, the African, maybe needing to demonstrate in their own mind that they are throwing off this sense of inferiority, and that creates new problems of trying to connect with individuals. Even unintentional slights can be seen as significant barriers to cultural connection. Economic underdevelopment of agriculture and industry can create a dependence on cash crops and global markets. So if the colonists were instructed to grow things that you couldn't eat per se, but were sold on the global market for European benefit, even if they brought in food, later on, when they became independent, these countries their economies are bound to these cash crops. And as a result, they are forced to depend on the international markets for their economy. They can't grow their own food. They could, but they're spending all their time growing chocolate or growing spices or growing things that they don't use, they sell. And that creates, or the land is still owned. This is some of the Zimbabwe, some of those countries. The land was still owned by white settlers, and they used that to grow cash crops and still impoverish the native populations and could create new issues there. Now, how did missions relate to imperialism? There are three different ways. Active collaboration. Some missionaries sought imperial control or paved the way for it. So we have to recognize that this did happen, that missionaries did assist at times in setting up colonial regimes. In 1888, London Missionary Society missionary, the Reverend Charles Helm, intentionally translated a document that helped cheat Africans out of territory because he believed that Christianity would be better served by European control. So he mistranslated a document that brought the colonial power into his area of control, because he believed that if the British took over this area, they would bring conditions where the gospel could spread more easily. Please, if you're ever a missionary, do not do something that is deceptive in order to help out God later on. That never ends well. That's always bad. Now that's probably the worst example that I could give you of a person intentionally misrepresenting. Now, usually though, what would happen is a missionary would be in a situation where he feels that there would be an advantage if this area was under British control or French control. So they would invite people they knew in the government to annex this territory so that it would be more conducive for missionary efforts. So the missionary would say, hey, if this place was under British control, I would have more freedom and better protection and wouldn't be in danger in the way that I am. And so I'm going to try and get the British to come and take this area over. Now, maybe that is definitely collaboration, but it's more honorable than lying. That's how it usually went. Now, then the opposite end, from active collaboration to active resistance to colonialization. A few missionaries encouraged active resistance to imperialism. Usually, these were missionaries that were serving in areas that were ethnically different from the group wanting to colonize an area. Yeah.
Is that, is Bartolomé de las Casas a good example of that stood up for the indigenous people?
Well, yes, I think we could use him. Now, of course, he was not against Spanish control, but he certainly would have objected to how the Spanish were treating the people in South America, and in that case, the Caribbean islands. So he definitely would have been somewhere in a more middle ground area. So he wasn't against Spanish control, but he was certainly for treating them with the native population with honor, and he was very progressive in that because most people just didn't care. So yeah, he would definitely fit into here somewhere, and that's a good thinking of an individual of that type. Now, Franz Michael Zahn objected to German taking of Togo. European powers had no right to take over other peoples. Of course, Togo is the African country next to Benin, and there's Nigeria and Benin and Togo and the Gold Coast along there. So that was a little German colony. European powers had no right to take over other peoples. Extending German imperial power to Africa would be detrimental, and worried that this would hinder the spread of Christianity. He thought that Christianity would get a bad reputation or whatever, and that Christianity would not grow as quickly because of colonization. Walter Miller became disillusioned with British colonial government in Nigeria and encouraged incipient nationalism among the Hausa people in the north, and helped found the political organization Northern People's Congress, which eventually would help unite Nigeria and bring about independence. A more common ground would be what we see here. More missionaries welcomed the stability, safety, and infrastructure of a moderate colonial regime. So what they wanted was some kind of colonial structure that gave them a feeling of support and connection, but at the same time was not exploitive of the people. And I think Casas would definitely fall under that category. The Church of Scotland mission openly called for a British protectorate in Malawi because of an ongoing disruptive problem of theft, local warfare, and slave trading. To solve those problems, David Livingstone was convinced that colonization would further the expansion of Christianity and provide a more secure setting and greater authority on the ground a decade before the scramble for Africa. So even in the late 60s, early 70s, 1860s, early 70s, he believed that it was important to continue with British control of this interior, because that would help spread of Christianity. Of course, he was not really a great missionary. You know, he only converted one person in his entire career. Most of the time when he was exploring, he was lost, didn't know where he was. You know, Dr. Livingston, I presume. I think you're the emaciated individual that is hardly able to move. Is that you? Then, some racism was present, but not as blatant as at home. So usually, I mean, I'm sure that there were European colonists and missionaries that were outright racist, that were just in your face, rude, white supremacist rhetoric on the mission field. But it was more likely for those type of people to be back in England. Because if you were too blatant with your racism in Africa, something bad could happen to you. There were still more of them than there were Europeans. So there was racism, but probably not of that type very often. Where you really would see it is paternalism, and the idea that you felt like you were caring for a child, and you went about your business in that way. And that can demoralize the people that you are working with. If you're constantly treating them as though they're inferior to you, children are inferior to you. Yeah.
What is word that you just said? What's that mean?
Paternalism,
Yeah.
that you are treating them as a parent. And that can warp your way of thinking. I remember one time we were in some sort of staff meeting, and Mr. Lomer was giving a talk about submission to authority, and all of his illustrations was dealing with were his relation with his kids. And someone said, hey, we're not your kids. I mean, we are employees, and you're the dean and the executive vice president, and any one of us could probably be the dean and executive. We're all willing to listen to you, but there's a status difference between parent and child that is organic, that is different than this. So the way of looking at it, you need to look at how you deal with us differently than how you deal with your kids. That can be, and it's something to think through, that you would deal with that sort of thing in your own relation with your staff, and your relationship with students. Students, teacher, that is a status of that's organically different in some ways. But so this here creates, because let's face it, if you're on the mission field and you're dealing with Africans, you have to look at them as being equal with you, because they are. Just because they're the native and you're the missionary doesn't mean that they aren't in some way superior to you are, if you could get rid of this racial difference. Just let everyone become organically placed where they belong. Some of them could do your job better than you. So we have to recognize that that's how, and this can cause, that kind of thinking can cause a lot of damage. Many missionaries had a higher view of the indigenous culture than most of the colonial administrators, and this helped soften imperial cultural disruption, because the missionaries often did see the local population as better than many of the indigenous cultures, many of the government officials did. So if you're going to have a good cop, bad cop way of looking at it, the missionary was the person who could get in there and soothe wounds. after the government official, whacked them too hard, the colonists knew, the local population knew the missionary was there to help out. And maybe could even intervene in some ways to try and moderate this. They commonly decried colonial abuses and mistreatment of the local population, and that's exactly what Nicasis does. He stands in the way and says, listen, you're being mean to them, and you gotta improve, and that's what a lot of the missionaries did. Kept this abuse under control. Now let's take a look at a few examples here. The Church Missionary Society in Uganda, and how this plays out in practical, as a practical example. The Burgundian king Mutisia I in 1871 opened court to the Church Missionary Society missionaries, resulting in a steady number of converts. In 1884, a civil war will break out between Protestant Catholics and Islam after his son ascended to the throne. So when his son ascends to the throne, the different factions, whether they're Catholic or Protestant or Muslim, are going to fight a war for control. The father, all of these groups felt loyal to the father, but the son, and this can easily happen, the father had not created a sense of community where they also felt loyal to his son, and when his son takes over, there's an independence movement. So a civil war, 3 ways. 3 different groups fighting among themselves. So that's disastrous. British East India Company came in 1890 to claim and administer the colonies in East Africa, and the British East India Company, and would bring economic control and then eventually political control, and this would be Kenya, Uganda, eventually Tanzania too, but that's a British colony. But Kenya, Uganda, and to a lesser degree, Rwanda, and there's another little country in there. Burundi, yeah, would have British influence. So those areas would be under what we would think of as British East India. Now, Captain Frederick Lugar obtained a treaty of protection from King Wanga when the British East India Company needs finances. The Church Missionary Society raised sufficient funds to keep their soldiers in the country in 1882. So the British East India Company didn't have an East Africa Company, did not have enough money to keep their military there. I guess business was not booming. So the missionaries raised money to pay for private security to keep them in the country. And the Church Missionary Society lobbied hard for the British to take control of Uganda in 1896 and make it a part of the British Empire. And that would change things. Now, another aspect of this whole process that is going to interface here is scientific racism, which is a brand new thing in the late 1800s. There's always racism. But now it is built around Darwinian evolutionary theory and the social development of humanity. That it's not just that some people are weaker and other people are stronger. So the Europeans are stronger than the Africans, or whatever the case may be, or the people of South America, and so they come in there and they have guns and they have whatever. they take them over. But now there is this new idea being embedded into the thinking of Europeans that people are evolving. And that humanity used to be apes, but that in the future, the human race will subdivide into superior and inferior groups. Now, this is truly Darwinian. If you read his book, The Descent of Man, which is his second book, he clearly lays out how this is going to work, because it fits, it's obvious that if you believe in Darwinian evolution, that this is the next natural step, that certain people are better than others, biologically, scientifically. There are inferior races and there are superior races. And it feeds into all of the thinking about white nationalism, white supremacy, colonization, and so forth. But even things like Nazism, the belief that white Anglo, for them, the Aryan race was superior. So even within what you might consider to be the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the WASP concept that certain people are at the pinnacle of society, even within that, Nazis believed that was subdividing into other groups, so that they were trying to eliminate inferior people. And this would be true about most of the intellectuals around the turn of the century. Clearly, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson would have accepted these ideas that Europeans are superior. And now those people would not have said, let's eliminate, all of the inferior people, but it would say, under the next thing, paternalism, some people need to be cared for. And some people are burdened with the obligation of caring. And so that would be the way of looking at it. Some people need help. So the impact of scientific racism, which is being taught in the schools, is being imbued into the thinking of Europeans, generally speaking, is going to make its way into missionary theory and colonialization. You can't avoid it. And so that needs to be discerned. So when we talk about today, about American society or any white society, and that there's systemic racism, there is to some degree the influence of this thinking. And even the people who claim to be eradicating it believe in this, because they're not believing that God created humanity all the same. They're evolutionary just like everyone else.
Right.
What they're suggesting is that there's some other group than whites that are at the top of the pyramid, and that they should be mistreated. So they don't necessarily believe in it. They still believe in this. They just have a different group there. Or that people are supposed to be ashamed of their past behavior without any way of making amends for it. You're just supposed to be guilty and feel, you're just supposed to be and anything that you do, like handing money around or whatever, doesn't make you feel any better because it doesn't do any good. There are real solutions, but those solutions would not give the people who want control of this process power. So they're not really working towards a solution. So what this does is it taught that white Anglo-Saxon tunic races were fully human or superiorly human, or were in the group that was in the evolutionary track to become whatever humanity was becoming, and the other people would be left behind when the race divides. All other races were an earlier evolutionary stage, or were not participating in the evolutionary advance that was going to take place. Superior races had the obligation to take upon itself trusteeship to ensure that inferior people were governed fairly and justly, because they couldn't be trusted to care for themselves. And if bad members of this group mistreated them, so the good ones, the Christians or whomever, have to take control so that we are sure that they are treated kindly. After 1880, the number of missionaries explored and new areas. There were many more of them. In the late Victorian era, going as a missionary became very popular. And missionaries, I mean, I want to go and help the people in a foreign land and help the people in darkest Africa or wherever the case may be. I mean, that was really popular. And there was a burgeoning group, if you read like, Oliver Twist and Davy Copperfield, I mean, there were thousands of people in the slums of London and other places. There were just too many people. What do you do with them? There's not enough work. I'll tell you one thing, you want to have a good life, being a missionary was a great option in that era. Much better than just living in the slums of London, trying to get by. Go be a missionary. And then there was all of this other things coming along with it. So just a burgeoning idea. Because of this, there was less need for indigenous pastors, as there were in that earlier period we talked about with the Three Self movement. They couldn't get enough missionaries in the 1850s and 60s. Now in the 1880s, there's surplus of missionaries. They have more candidates than they have jobs. And so you don't need native missionaries or native pastors. You can supply them with someone from London who speaks Cockney, and they can't be understood anyway. Trust of indigenous leadership decreased, especially if you believe in scientific racism. These people are inferior people. So even if you had people willing, the European is better qualified biologically to serve. That's embedded in the back of your mind. And a reluctance to turn leadership over to them would also be true. In 1890, the Anglicans recommended a 10-year moratorium on new native priests. We are not going to have any more native priests for 10 years. Increase the permanent deacons. So deacons are, in the Anglican Church, in other churches of this type, there is a three-step level of ordination. You're ordained a deacon, then you're ordained a priest, and then you're ordained a bishop. And if you're not ordained a deacon, you can't be ordained a priest. So that's a step, 3 steps. And often they would say that those who are ordained deacons can serve on the board. They're sort of like lay leaders in the church, and it's out of that pool that they pick preachers. So the native population were being ordained deacons, and they knew that's as far as it's going to go for them. So they would be the persons helping the British priests that came to pastor their church. And more European missionaries are needed to supervise them. As a result, ethnocentrism becomes a part of this culture. African countries lacked Western education, modern medicine, and representative government. Missionaries often had a higher view of native culture than the home country or the colonial officials, but there was a sense that there was an unhealthy attachment to the way things are at home. Let's take a look here. Trailblazers in the scientific study of vernacular languages and traditional cultures. The first person here is Johann Christaller. Studied African languages, translating the Bible into the Twi language, collecting, translating, and preserving oral histories, legends, and proverbs. He would go around and ask the Africans, what are your stories? Whereas most of the Europeans could care less. Their cultural stories and I want to hear your songs. We want to record those, for posterity, because that's important. Even if I never want to hear this again, it's important because it's important to you. It's who you are. He did not see African language as being evolutionarily inferior to a European language. That is making a step in the right direction. Whereas in most cases, you can lose track of who you are by constantly looking at yourself. When you're doing communications, I talk about looking at your cultural navel. Because if you look at your own navel, it's hard to see anybody else. You ever try and do that? It's hard to look at other people while you're doing that. So you're focused on yourself. And we can do that culturally. We can do that culturally at any level. And in some places, it's insulary. I mean, there aren't people around that really are different than you. But let's keep, he's a great example. John Weeks worked in the Congo and gained sensitive understanding of the local culture and religion. He published a book in the Royal Archaeological Institute of Great Britain in 1909 called Anthropological Notes on the Bangala People. And that is an ethnographic study of those people that lived in the Congo and what they were like. He tried to capture the native mind in explaining native beliefs and culture. So he tried to explain and describe what the native culture was like from their perspective. That's important. Many missionaries were humanitarian activism. Now, when we talk about our next lesson, and I will be posting the thing for that. The next lesson deals with the Edinburgh Missionary Conference and how that transforms missions. That's in 1911, 10, somewhere in there. But the question is, what is missions? Is missions preaching the gospel and handing out tracts and spreading, trying to get people saved, or is it doing humanitarian intervention? And what's more important? But really, missions does have this aspect to it. missionaries would see themselves as the conscience of the empire. So if there was going to be someone who would say, this is wrong, it would be the missionary. So it's okay in the colonial era to see the missionary sort of as the conscience of the empire, that they would say to the colonial officials, you're being bad. Even if they have believed in colonialization, you're treating the people wrongly. They would oppose colonial abuses in general and would lodge reports, send letters back to members of parliament and say, hey, this is what's going on, and this needs to be stopped or changed or transformed. That's an important role to play. It's not as much an opportunity today. You go to be a missionary in Brazil, you deal with the Brazilian government. It doesn't matter what America's doing exactly, you gotta deal with them. It doesn't matter about the Portuguese. There may be abuses, and you might speak out against them. Let's say you did speak out against abuses by the Brazilian government against their own people. Well, guess what? You're not Brazilian, and guess who's going to go home? Back then, you were British. And if you had the protection of the British government, you could speak out against it because the people doing this abuse were British too. So you had a bit of standing that no longer sometimes can be the case. Also, the mistreatment of indigenous people. Probably the worst place was the abuses that were present in the Congo Free State. Leopold was the proprietor and invested in natural resources. His two main things that he wanted to extract from the Congo were ivory and rubber. Both, you could say, are an agricultural product. But people were treated harshly. They were treated in a way that is it's not just abuse. I mean, it was intense mistreatment. That word is not the word I want to use, because when you're chopping off people's hands and so forth because they didn't bring enough rubber for their quota, that's just not mistreatment. I mean, that's going beyond just that word, but I'm not sure what word to use. But so, and there really weren't Belgians there to speak out. It had to be other countries that were intervening, or people from outside. In the Angolan Belgian Rubber Company set monthly rubber quotas for each village. Each village was required to produce a certain amount of rubber. And when they would come in, and this really became important after the invention of rubber tires in 1888. They needed rubber, lots of it. And so they would go in and say, every tribe or every village must produce so much rubber a month. And let's say there was a problem with your production. Too bad. Something bad would happen. People would have hands chopped off. Someone would be whipped or beaten, or whatever the case may be. There was going to be severe punishment. Soldiers were sent to enforce the quotas with penalties like burning down a village, taking female hostages, imprisoning people, cutting off hands, and sometimes even killing people. At first, missionaries supported Leopold, believing that the report of abuses were isolated aberrations or exaggerated. But that was not the case. These were actual pictures of people from at that time that you can see. It was very common. African American missionary, he's an American missionary, but he's an African, George Washington Williams, that's a great name, George Washington Williams, personally witnessed the abuses while visiting the Congo. He published an open letter to King Leopold that was published in newspapers all across Europe and reported what he found personally to President Benjamin Harrison about the crimes against humanity that were being conducted so that the President of the United States could intervene to help out when he went on diplomatic missions to Europe. And Benjamin Harrison was willing to do that. So another African-American Presbyterian will also be involved. So it's African-Americans that are serving as missionaries in Africa that will begin the process of exposing this and getting this stopped, which I can be glad was the case. Okay, we'll finish this up next time, and I will give you a new PowerPoint, or we will, if you have some things that have stood out to you from your text, we may talk about that too, a little bit.
Thanks.
Yeah.